So this video, we're going to cover Chapter 21, Continuity and Change in East Asia from 1400 to 1800. The sections in this chapter are over Ming China, the Manchus and Qing China, Japan's Middle Ages, the Tokugawa Shogunate, and maritime trade, piracy, and the entry of Europe into the Asian maritime sphere. It's a lot to cover, but let's get right into it. So we're starting with the Ming Dynasty. And we're going to start talking about the founder of that dynasty. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang, and he grew up during the end of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. He became an orphan during a drought that was followed by a plague. I mean, the kid couldn't catch a break, it sounds like. He and a surviving brother, they went to a monastery, but they were sent out to beg for food. A religious sect identified as the Red Turbans rose in rebellion against the Mongols, and when the temple where he and his brother were staying, it was burned down, so he decided to join the rebels and rose to the level of general. He then made Nanjing and made the city his base. He then took his army to Beijing and declared himself emperor of the Ming Dynasty. As emperor, he became known. He's going to fall under a different name, and his name will be Taizu. And he continued some of the Mongols' practices. Provinces were set up as the administrative layer between the central and local governments, and families that were classified as military had to supply a soldier at all times. Garrisons were built along the northern border during this dynasty, and land was supplied for the soldiers to grow their own food. However, the garrisons were not very self-sufficient. The Ming turned to non-Chinese for armed forces, and the Mongols began to serve in the Ming military. The emperor's behavior became erratic, and he fell into rages. Only the empress could stop. When she died, there was no one that could seem to calm him down. So he had thousands of officials killed who had taken shortcuts in paperwork for the grain tax. Thousands more were killed when he thought there was an assassination plot against him. The emperor was succeeded by one of his sons. Like his father, Chunzu used terror to keep his government under control, and he also moved the capital to Beijing. So here we have the Great Wall. This is all of Ming China here in the orange. And then you can see the Grand Canal built here. And here's Beijing. And you have to remember the Great Wall was built to keep out like nomadic tribes, the raiders, the Mongols out. It's all defensive, right? And this is part of the Great Wall. More is going to be added to it later. Also, we have the Forbidden City. Probably, I don't know, when you guys think of China, this is the image that comes to my head. I mean, of course, the Great Wall, but also the Forbidden City. Like the emperor's quarters, essentially. Like this is the palace. So the emperor, he had abolished the position of chancellor, and what that did is it forced those emperors to come after him. So this is after Taizu. Those emperors following him, they had to use secretaries and eunuchs to manage the paperwork. So remember, eunuchs, they are castrated males who were highly trusted by their rulers. And during the Ming Dynasty, the eunuch bureaucracy grew into a large organization. Emperor Taizu's punishments were extreme. One official who upset him was brought to the capital in chains and left to starve to death in prison. Another event saw officials staging a protest by kneeling in front of the palace. Taizu ordered them to kneel for 3 days, then had the men flogged, killing 11 of the officials. Even though the Ming Dynasty used Mongols in the military, there was a constant concern that Mongolian power would again rise and contest imperial China. So that's why the Great Wall was built as a compromise when Ming officials could not agree on how to manage the Mongol threat. The Mongols were introduced to Tibetan Buddhism, and when Tibetan monasteries were threatened, they asked the Mongols for support. So ties between Mongolia and Tibet became very strong for that reason. For the Chinese, Mongolian acceptance of Buddhism was an encouraging development. So if you took the first part of this history class, you took, World History 1, we talked a little bit about examinations, and that's how you kind of got your leadership role within certain Asian cultures. You would take your exam and you would study years for this exam. It wasn't like, I'm just going to study for a few months or a few weeks and hope I do well. No, this was like your entire life led up to the taking and the successful, hopefully, passing of this exam in order to get into those government positions. So even though the Ming rulers treated civil servants terribly, educated men were eager for the chance to serve in the government. because that meant stability. That meant you were getting paid. And sometimes the form of payment would come in food and protection and housing. It wasn't always, like money like we think of in pay. But if you were working for the government, there was that sense of security with it. So all of the officials were recruited through the civil service examinations, not just on merit. Candidates taking the exams, they had to study classic Confucian thought and understanding their interpretations presented by the Confucian scholar. And I think we eventually get to him, but his name is Zhu Zi. Well-established families had an advantage because they started their son's education very early on. Chinese clans established schools to help their members successfully take the exams and bring prestige to the group. Examinations lasted a day and drew hundreds of thousands of candidates hoping to be able to gain a position as a government official. Grading the exam took nearly 20 days. Those who passed the initial exams, they were then sent to take the next level, the capital exams, which were scheduled the following year. So everyday life in Ming China. So we have a lot of large towns and cities kind of proliferated in Ming times and became cultural centers. Printing began in earlier Chinese dynasties, but it transformed the culture of the Ming Empire. Publishing houses were producing books for the general public. The full-length novel made its first appearance during the Ming Dynasty. Plays were so popular that Chinese citizens read the play scripts. Farmers intensified their efforts to get as much food from the land as possible. They planted useful trees, such as fruit trees and mulberry trees need to feed silkworms, and they began devoting more land to commercial crops such as cotton, sugarcane, and indigo. Han Chinese farmers also moved into land previously occupied by other ethnic groups, especially in the southwest. Increased food production led to steady population growth and the multiplication of markets. So talking about its decline. So fiscal, military, and political problems. That's what plagued all of the Ming rulers. The government protected the Koreans from the Japanese, which nearly bankrupted the Ming Dynasty. Expensive natural disasters such as locust plagues, droughts, and floods caused misery throughout all of China. Gangs of army deserters stormed the grain storage for food during times of food shortages. They were also joined by starving Chinese farmers. A shortage of silver caused a financial concern. The Ming had used silver, these little silver pieces, as currency to replace paper money. And the silver had entered China as trade for silk. When the trade was disrupted by Japan, the silver became scarce. So we have another group, the rise of the Manchus, and this is a people of Manchuria that lived close to the Mongols, Koreans, and the Chinese. They were hunters, fishermen, and farmers, and they had excellent horsemanship skills. They had settlements that were small, and they survived by fishing, farming wheat and millet, and also by collecting pelts for trade. Villages were often at odds with each other, and the men never left without taking their weapons with them. Manchu power increased under the leadership of the leader Nurhaci. He created banners which were military units that included the soldiers' families and slaves. We have, there's a Ming general. His name was Wu Zongyi, and I probably mispronounced that, so I'm sorry about that pronunciation, but he allowed the Manchus to enter China when they promised to join forces to liberate Beijing from rebels. After occupying Beijing, the Manchus conquered all of China and established the Qing dynasty. The Manchu leaders ordered the Chinese to shave the front of their heads in the Manchu style for easy identification during battle. When many refused to shave, they destroyed defiant cities but left many of the Ming policies in place. And so by this time in history, we do have gunpowder weapons, and that's a key element in warfare. Western innovation in such weapons were used by the Ming in conflicts with the Manchus. So like taking that and making it, not just these huge cannons, but actually where it's like handheld guns, muskets, that kind of thing that harness the power of gunpowder. Just to give you an idea of all these places that we're talking about, right? So here's the China that we've been talking about for the most part. You can see the Great Wall has been extended a little bit more. Here's Tibet. We have Mongolia, Manchuria, Don't forget, here's Japan over to the side and Korea. Japan is going to be a threat that's always kind of out there lingering that will invade parts of China, even into Korea sometimes, into this Manchuria, which is going to be eventually taken over by the Russian Empire. They're going to fight for this area as we get closer to modern history. Kangxi was a Qing dynasty ruler, and he began ruling on his own when he was 14. He worked on converting the Ming loyalists to the Qing dynasty. To show good effort, he held special exams to select Ming loyalists who would write the official history of the Ming dynasty. He does live a long time, and because of that, his son, Yuanzhang, had a short rule of only 13 years. But Yuanzhang's son, his name is Qianlong, he would have a long rule as Qing leader. He was multilingual and he tried to establish unity. He was also tolerant of the various religious practices throughout the Chinese Empire. Qianlong was concerned about elements within society he thought were not willing to support his rule. He became active in censorship of books, having chapters deleted or the complete text destroyed. Under his rule, China continued to produce vast amounts of manufactured goods such as silk and porcelain. Just to give you an idea, this is depiction of presenting a horse to the emperor. In case you're wondering kind of what it looked like during this time period, it's always good just to have a visual reference, I think. So let's talk a little bit about expanding the empire, right? Imperial expansion. By the early 1700s, the Qing dynasty established garrisons for banner soldiers in Tibet. The Qing's rulers' territory was now encroaching on Russian lands. A treaty was written in Russian, Manchu, Chinese, and Latin that defined the shared border between Manchuria and Russia. Another treaty allowed Russia to establish a trade route between Beijing and Russia. Chinese Turkestan was the last region to be annexed by the Qing dynasty. Okay, we're going to switch over and we're going to talk, about Japan's Middle Ages for a few minutes. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Muromachi culture. So the Ashikaga shoguns of Kyoto, Japan were located on a street. They were located on Muromachi Street, and their refined and elegant style became known as Muromachi culture. Zen monks were able to read and write in Chinese, and they assisted the shoguns in foreign affairs. Therefore, the shoguns began patronizing Zen Buddhism. So Shogun Yoshimasa was a patron of the arts and built the Silver Pavilion. Theater was extremely popular among the shoguns, and many of the plays were about jealous ghosts wanting revenge. And then we have a civil war that breaks out, and it broke out between the shoguns, and it broke out in Kyoto of the secession of power. And what we see are hostages and prisoners being slaughtered and their corpses being mutilated. And after the city of Kyoto was destroyed, the fighting is going to spread into the countryside. So then we have these warlords, and they're known as daimyo. They gained more power and seized what they needed to increase the security of their territories, and they are going to recruit samurai. The violent period influenced castle building, which were built on the plains and surrounded by moats and walls. The daimyo made their living quarters in those castles. Oda Nobunaga was the first powerful daimyo who recruited followers from a group of samurai that survived on robbery and extortion. Under him, Japan first established a form of government-issued currency and eliminated trade barriers. The small fishing village of Nagasaki became a major port. He was also forced to commit suicide after a coup attempt by one of his vassals. Hideyoshi succeeded in power throughout northern and western Japan, and he calmed the angry daimyo by offering them land and military positions if they swore allegiance to his government. The rise of peasant sons would be restricted. Farmers were no longer permitted to carry weapons. Hideyoshi became adamant that taxes would be collected by making agents collect information on daimyo lands and population centers. Tax and collection was tightened, and peasant households were registered, tying the people to the land, not trying them. Although it was trying times, but they tied the people to the land. His rule faltered when he tried to conquer Korea and China, which ended with his death. And just to give you an idea of, I kind of pointed out on the last map, just kind of where we're at. Here's Japan. You can see how close it is to Korea. And then also going up the Korean peninsula into Ming China, or into just China proper itself. Also, here's one more just visual for you, kind of give you a break from reading and trying to keep up. Here's one of the castles that was built. It said that these were kind of built in the countryside along the plains. This is a traditional Japanese castle, not to be confused with how castles, like we're used to European castles probably when we think of a castle. Okay, moving into the next section, we're going to talk about Tokugawa. And Hideyoshi's longtime supporter, his name was Tokugawa Ieyasu, was the strongest regent in Japan, and this era of his power was called the Edo period. The Tokugawa shoguns worked to organize and consolidate relations with the daimyo. The alternate resident system was developed, which compelled lords to live in this time period, in the Edo period, every other year, and to leave their wives and children behind as captives. The peace that developed under the Tokugawa influenced the growth of the Japanese population. Each social status was expected to maintain their boundaries. The rules implemented kept the daimyo from attacking the Tokugawa shoguns. Repairs on old castles and the construction of new castles was restricted, and a policy was enacted that segregated the Tokugawa samurai from the peasants. Concerns about Christian influences and conversion influenced Japan to limit its contacts with the outside world. Here's another map for you. We're just going to move on, but just so you know which area we've been talking about. We talked about Kyoto. Here's Edo, which will then become Tokyo eventually. So the civil war between the shoguns that we talked about just a few minutes ago, that promoted an economic change that had an influence on the development of Japanese society. Trade increased and markets developed at river crossings and other places where people met in groups. Money lending became a business with extremely high interest rates, and so money lenders had to be licensed, which protected their lucrative financial market. Merchant families with special privileges from the government ran the urban economy. A single merchant family would become the dominating force in the trade of a specific product. The families created patterns and procedures for their business deals and operations, and this created the modern Japanese business formula identified as the Industrious Revolution. The Japanese cities had a large labor force of unemployed farmers and samurai who were used to produce manufactured goods and other luxury items. Japanese cities contained forms of entertainment for men. These included tea houses, restaurants, and brothels. Some poor parents sold their daughters to entertainment establishments where the most attractive girls became geishas. Commercial publishing created a supply of reading material that included fiction and play scripts. Farmers were taxed into a bare level of subsistence. Peasants were only allowed to wear cotton or hemp. They were forbidden to wear silk. The extravagant lifestyles of the upper-level population were financed by the taxes of the peasants. This led to resentment and revolts that led to widespread burning and destruction. These protests, they do lead to lower taxes. However, we see natural disasters constantly causing trouble for Japanese society. Japan was a volcanic island, and so they're going to experience earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Famines resulting from failed crops caused by the heavy volcanic ash led to social unrest. So natural disasters, that's going to lead to a lot of unrest. Just like, think about now, the pandemic. We don't really we did see some unrest. We have seen unrest, even in our country during this pandemic. Imagine our food sources completely gone, which I'm sure if you've been shopping, you've kind of seen that. But, if you can't, that's one way to start a lot of unrest is people that are starving. Peasants who improved their fields and increased their harvest still paid the same tax rate and were allowed to keep the surplus profit. Coastal fishing expanded during the Edo period, and new uses and techniques for preserving fish developed. Fishermen also began to hunt whales. Japanese villages had a mix of families that were affluent and those who struggled, the haves and the have-nots essentially. The affluent families received their education and preferred societal positions. After marriage, the women moved to their husband's home and served both the husband and the mother-in-law. Inheritance went to a single son who would maintain the family line. Poorer women worked alongside their husbands and shared the responsibility for the family economic situation. Japanese restricted the number of children born by allowing abortion and infanticide. And now moving into the final section of this chapter, we get to talk about Zheng He. So the Ming Dynasty tried to reestablish their domination of East Asia. Earlier Han and Tang dynasties sent missions abroad. The Ming authorized voyages to the Indian Ocean under the command of Zheng He. He was a Muslim eunuch. So some of the voyages included a fleet with like 317 ships. Some of those ships were 440 feet long. The voyage crew included between 20,000 and 32,000 men. It's like massive. The voyage destinations included Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, and later as far as East Africa. The voyages, they were expensive, and officials began to complain about the cost and argue that the voyages did not bring in enough wealth to allow them to continue, and many of the ships were dismantled to salvage the lumber. The Chinese continued trading in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, but only on the private business level. One of Zheng He's goals during his overseas expedition was to suppress piracy. The Japanese islands were loaded with pirates waiting for ships to pass along the trade routes. And although Japan was blamed for the pirates, they included men recruited from a variety of countries, not just from Japan. The success of the pirates may have encouraged Hideyoshi, the leader of Japan, to try and extend his territory across the seas. When the Koreans congratulated him for his victories, he requested permission to send troops through Korea to attack China. He also sent demands for the submission of the Philippines and countries of Southeast Asia. As the Japanese troops entered Korea to pass into China, they overwhelmed Korean defenders, and Chinese armies entered to support the Koreans and push back the Japanese. After the death of Hideyoshi, sorry, I keep pronouncing that wrong, the Japanese withdrew but left Korea in ruins. So under the Joseon dynasty, Koreans began to reestablish themselves socially and economically. So here are the Japanese pirate raids in green, so kind of extending out from Japan, just like the different places that your book mentioned. Also remember the Portuguese trade route, so Portugal coming, Portugal's over here on the other side of Europe, beside Spain, coming down. At this point, I guess they would have been crossing through the Mediterranean, through the Turkish Empire coming across. They haven't quite yet sailed around by 1400, not quite yet. It's in the 1500s when they make it all the way around down the tip of South Africa. But you can also see, like, imperialism, it's a huge thing. So you're going to see Portuguese claim here and like these orange kind of along the different coast. And then also you'll notice the Spanish claims in blue. Not a ton, but there are some Spanish claims. So just FYI for you, it's not just the Japanese that are trying to conquer and set up. We also have European countries that are coming and trying to conquer different parts of Asia. And that's what we're going to talk about. The Portuguese and the Dutch, they used force to gain control of trade and seize outposts along the trade routes throughout Asia. The Portuguese were allowed to build a trading post near the mouth of the Pearl River, and the post became the city of Macau. China did not have a demand for European products, but wanted silver. Europeans mined silver in the New World, specifically South America, and sent it to China for trade. An exchange of crops did take place that brought sweet potatoes, corn, peanuts, tomatoes, and chili peppers to East Asia, and these crops were quickly incorporated into the Asian diet. Spanish and Portuguese kings encouraged missionaries to travel into Asia. The Jesuits were the first to enter and promoted Catholic education. Remember, that's a sect of Catholic monks known as the Jesuits. Francis Xavier worked in India and then turned his attention to China and Japan. He was successful among Japan's poor, but he died before he could actually enter into China. The Jesuits learned the Chinese language so they could communicate with the population. The Jesuit priest, his name was Ricci, I believe, studied, and before he entered the city of Nanjing, he and other Jesuits believed that Confucianism was compatible with Christianity because both shared common values of morality and virtue. Like most religions do, they're teaching you how to be a good person. And they were able to find that in Confucianism and Christianity, those same virtues and kind of moral laws that are established in both religions. The Chinese were interested in Western learning, and scientific and philosophical questions were discussed in the Jesuits' courts. Europe had a positive view of China. Voltaire discussed the rationalism of Confucianism and the advantage of the Chinese political system. Chinese medical practices were also innovative. Europeans adopted an inoculation of smallpox from the Chinese medical doctors. Great Britain did not want to allow the Chinese to dictate the terms of trade in Asia, and so the king sent an envoy to China who was to secure a place for British trade. The British representative, Lord Macartney, did not receive a formal audience but met informally with the Chinese emperor. The emperor granted the establishment of trade through kindness, not necessity. So the next chapter we're going to actually discuss, we're going to skip chapter 22, we're going to go straight into 23, and we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution that began in Britain. And later on, we're going to kind of circle back to East Asia and other parts of Asia. But in time, not only does the revolutions, like the political ones that happened, which we all know about the American Revolution, hopefully you know a little bit about the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, but then that Industrial Revolution, all of those are going to profoundly alter East Asia as well. Just kind of thinking about that, like these will all connect back together in a couple of chapters, so stay tuned for that.